Everyone, welcome back to Beyond the Scripts. I'm your host, Will Tuff with PioneerRx and RedSail Technologies, and today we actually have a crossover episode with hopefully a very familiar face to everybody out there. Welcome Josh Howland to the podcast.
Awesome. Thanks, Will.
So what is your official title these days?
That is a good question. Today, it is President of Pharmacy Management Solutions at RedSail. So tomorrow it might be building engineer or trash collector, but today, President Pharmacy Management Solutions.
Yeah. So I think that's one of the notable aspects of the culture at Pioneers, being able to stay agile and wear many hats. So you've been with Pioneer for quite a while. Of course, anytime there's like a change within a company, especially when you have, some of the most recognizable faces in the industry at the helm, there's definitely a noted change, and I can't think of anybody from within the company or without that would, really fill those gaps as well as you have. So tell me a little bit about how your journey at PioneerRx has gone, and then how that transitioned into RedSail Technologies.
Time is running out. Don't miss your chance to join us at the Connect 2025 Pharmacy Conference from June 5th to 8th in Grapevine, Texas. Register now before it's too late.
So it's kind of crazy. I came into RedSail, which was Pioneer at the time, off of coming out of a renal specialty pharmacy. So I was in charge of building clinical programs for patients on dialysis. So we would go in and work with home health, nephrology units, all kinds of stuff. So it was like a very, very clinical job, but effectively it was still kind of a product related role, right? A lot of, for better or for worse, there were a lot of drugs in dialysis that didn't really have good protocols for how to manage it. If you look at pharmacies today, that kind of equates to how we handle pharmacogenomics, where you can tell somebody very easily that you've got a gene, but you can't say, oh, hey, adjust this drug by 10 milligrams to do whatever, right? And that was how ESRD was 10 years ago. We all knew you had renal dosage adjustments. We just didn't have a good idea of how much. And when patients were dialysis patients, a small adjustment means they go to the hospital. And so I came to Pioneer, and my initial project was to work with Jeff to build high-touch clinical features. And this was originally around independent specialty pharmacies. Right around that time, I guess I'm lucky that I was reasonably okay at building product, because that was about the time that independent specialty pharmacies started going away, right? You had very niche things like PBM or health system, but that was about it. And about that time, CPSN came up. And so we were starting to readjust those care plans and care goals that we were building to be able to handle those. And then over time, Jeff was like, hey, you ran a call center, so let's build more people in Dallas, because Pioneer was getting bigger. This is our Pioneer motto of, you just put on whatever hat you need to put on that day. So we started moving some people, not moving, but building in Shreveport and Dallas. So for a while I had I think I've managed pretty much every team at Pioneer at this point. I had the RX local team. That was back when me and Mark were a team of 2 in the office. I had a couple of software developers, now the RX local software developers. And believe it or not, marketing and graphics.
Sure.
And then over time that became managed developers, managed product. And over the last, I guess, 7 years, that was designing and managing the product release of Pioneer and 2,500 or so features.
Yeah. I think over the years I've been found on the org chart underneath your name multiple times throughout the years. So I've definitely seen you, take a lot of different roles. But you mentioned features. So like that's one of the things that you've also been a big part of. Is not just like clinical consulting or management, but also some experience into the actual development as well, right?
Yeah, and that was probably one of the things that made Jeff and I work really well together. Is he was a really good engineer and understood how the technology worked, and I at one point was a really good pharmacist. I don't dispense drugs anymore, so I don't want to consider myself a good pharmacist. But at the end of it, it was a core of like we both really had a need to understand why somebody was doing something, what they were really trying to do, and kind of get to the core of that and say, all right, I'm not going to build you what you asked for. I'm going to build you what you need. And I think that's kind of the DNA of what makes Pioneer different. And that's the kind of the culture of product that we wanted to basically transition across all of RedSail, not just keep it in the Pioneer lane.
Yeah. That was definitely one of the early kind of things that made PioneerRx a little bit different, was that it was definitively not making a paper digital, and doing the same process just digitally. So fast forward years and years, and we've seen some tremendous growth in Pioneer, in terms of feature sets and also user adaptation and store count. And with the entrance of RedSail, that's definitely brought even more growth in so many different ways. So tell me a little bit about how RedSail Technologies, entering the picture has changed your role and how you've kind of evolved into that ecosystem.
Kind of flippantly, I do a lot more meetings now. No, but I think one of the things that, and I think you were definitely in the group of, we were at Pioneer and we were growing so fast pre-RedSail that we were starting to run into like the kind of existential question of what do you want to be when you grow up, right? We were adding stores so fast, and we were like, we couldn't hire fast enough. We were like, all right, how are we going to organize this thing to be able to handle it? And so RedSail kind of came in and helped us get over that first hump, which was how do we stabilize being that big and that fast, right? And I first started at Pioneer, I think we had 150 employees and like maybe 1,500 locations. When you started, we probably had like 8 locations.
I think we had a couple hundred locations, yeah.
Yeah, and so like we went from 1,500 to 3,000 in the same time frame that we went from 1,000 to 1,500. It was massive, and we kind of came in and settled it a little bit, and then they said, "Hey, let's go to 10,000," right? And so the maturity it takes to grow that fast and that stable. Sometimes we did that successfully, sometimes we didn't, but they came in and really kind of helped mature what we were able to do. Sometimes that meant adding structure. Sometimes that meant asking us, hey, do you have enough people? And that was one of the things that we had a proud culture of at Pioneer prior to RedSail, was we ran very, very lean. Like we didn't have a person to do that. We had, hey, you got a couple extra minutes, go knock that out. We joke about it in our old office in Shreveport. The installers built a lot of those offices and walls without permits. And like you could tell over time, you could see the installers getting much, much better at construction because the walls went from being wavy to straight. And so there was maturity and structure and kind of a wild investment in Pioneer from RedSail, not just in growing Pioneer, but taking the kind of culture that Pioneer had built and the software that Pioneer had built and saying, let's apply that to other places too, right? And I think that was important to to propagate what we were able to do over the last, I don't know, 4.5 years.
Yeah, for sure. The interesting thing was, as a young company, I started out as an installer. And so I built a lot of those offices too. I built my first office on the Pioneer Shreveport campus, actually, like cut the 2x4s and put them in. And that was, a unique way for PioneerRx to, have full-time benefits and everything, and instead of using contract, employment for the installation team. So often things were done creatively in those stages. And that's one of the things that I think is really interesting. I've heard over the years, Pioneer has changed. And, yeah, of course it has. And so one of the things that I always reference is there's a particular, there's tons of different growth models out there, but the grinders model, it's almost like they looked at Pioneer as like their single use case and made this whole growth model. And so I've been with it from, stage one, where it's like the creativity stage where the founder is going out on installs. And then, to stage two, where you start to see, other input from people on the team. And if you follow that chart down, there's a predictable growth where I can see each of those stages, and there's predictable, challenges at each of those stages. But we've kind of moved to that predictable stage of partnerships that allow you to grow. And yes, PioneerRx has changed. I think any product that's going to stay relevant is going to have to, though.
Yeah, one of the smartest things, and I kind of knew I'd made the right decision. I think Jeff and I were out on a couple of site visits, and we used to go see a lot of pharmacies and just like, hey, what are you doing? Why? What do you need to be doing? And we were in a pharmacy, and I won't name or shame them, but they said, I'd like Pioneer a lot more if you'd stop releasing so many features all the time. And Jeff looked at him and he was like, hey, if you want a software that's not going to change and continue to get better, then you picked the wrong software. And it was interesting to tell a customer, like, hey, that can be a culture that can be something you want, but that's not what we're going to do. And it's easy to say Pioneer changed, and I've heard more times than I could count. Oh, since RedSail bought us, Pioneer's done worse or done this. Like, I was in a lot of those features. I designed a lot of those features that when we rolled them out, immediately I took hundreds of angry calls of like, hey, why did you do that? Yeah. I actually had another pharmacist tell me one time, I'm like, have you ever been in a pharmacy? And I was like, well, I'm actually a pharmacist. So yeah. And he was like, well, that feature looks like you've never been in a pharmacy. And they weren't wrong, right? So part of changing and releasing as quickly as Pioneer does means that occasionally you're going to take 2 steps forward and 1 step back. But that's part of what we are, and that's part of how Pioneer keeps moving forward, is we've not been afraid to make mistakes. And I actually think that's one of the things that I respect most about when RedSail came in, was their general plan was don't break Pioneer, and not only let us keep doing those things, but encourage them with investment dollars. And if you look at it, the vast majority of people who would have been considered Pioneer leadership are either still here or are still here in expanded roles. You know, like I'm still here. Mark Bivens is still here, now the chief growth officer. Jenny Rose still here, leading a team in RAS and R&D. Paul Carrick's still here, leading our data and data reporting group. Like all of those people have been able to take what made Pioneer special and help kind of make the rest of RedSail interesting as well. And now the other part of that is they brought in some people who are really, really innovative and smart, and kind of gave us the tools to help push us, right? It's easy to get to the top and get complacent. and then somebody else comes behind you and out innovates you and you're dead. And so it's wildly important that we continue to change. And I hope that we continue to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I will say too, on the PioneerRx side, it is interesting to, see the familiar faces. Like when I started there were, a cluster of support desks on one floor and development upstairs, but it was all of our hardware, all of our software support in that one building. And a lot of those same faces that helped teach me and helped me when I was a new installer, and even now when I visit pharmacies. I was, so glad to get Christy Foster on the phone the other day, where, she's helped me in so many other pharmacies, for 14 years. So a lot of those same faces, even down the line, are just, they're in leadership roles within support, so.
Well, not just that. I mean, you had several installers who are now sales guys. We had that consultant group, also a sales guy. We have been leading the trade show stuff. Gina out of support's now our director of product development. I think it's really cool to be able to take people who've been here 10, 15 years and expand their role. I'm probably most proud of that part.
Yeah.
Versus anything else.
Yeah, I think that's how you can really help to, grow and keep that same kind of authenticity and not lose the secret sauce.
Mm-hmm.
So, at this point, we've only talked about PioneerRx, but of course, RedSail Technologies in that growth model has taken on some other products as well. And if you would have told me that at Connect, I would be planning, courses to include BestRx and NRX and, all of the other product lines that are included with RedSail Technologies, that would have been hard to imagine just a couple years ago. And, here we are. So tell me a little bit about that kind of growth and, what that's looked like from your side.
Yeah. So I think the kind of guiding principle is like, go buy things that are innovative and interesting, and also that have people who kind of fit the mold of what you want everyone to be like. And when we were talking to BestRx, the president of Best, Hemel Desai, was really smart, really engaging. Cared a lot about his employees. He cared a lot about his customers, and he fit very much in that. Like, honestly, if you had told me you walked into a PioneerRx office in 2018 when you went to Chicago, I wouldn't have doubted it for a second.
Yeah.
So culturally and mentally, they were like, all right, we get it. We're going to do this stuff. So bringing those guys in, and they had built some really cool tools for software that were kind of adjacent to what Pioneer was planning. And in fact, tomorrow, Hemel and I are going to meet and kind of figure out how we tie some of those things together. Like, how do we get the best of some of the things that Pioneer built to work in BestRx? And how do we get some of the things that BestRx built that you're kind of like, how the heck did you do that? And we're going to try and, share some of that learning across the board, where we raise both platforms to a level, because they did some things that I think are just really, really smart. And obviously, I think we did some things that were really smart as well. So those are the types of things that are exciting. Like when you can go buy something, and if you look at the history of like mergers and acquisitions, like really big companies buying another one usually means that they both get worse. And I think we've been, I hope it's smart about that rather than lucky, but I think we've been smart about buying things that elevate all of the products, not just one.
Yeah. So, one of the things that I talk about a lot, is just communication. People come up and ask questions when I'm at trade shows, and they say, well, how was it really? And, it's hard to have the same level of communication, with 12,000 locations as you had with, 200 in one of those early business stages. It's just difficult to do that. And, and when you have that kind of space, it's kind of like the History Channel, where anything that happens, if you don't have data points for it, was it aliens? Did aliens do this? And I think the same thing happens when you're dealing with larger companies, especially when private equity is involved. Anything that is that happens, whether it's a positive or a negative, I think sometimes is just kind of painted with that light. Mm-hmm. Ever since RedSail Technologies, ... And sometimes, it is related. Sometimes causation is not, or correlation is not causation. So there are some things I want to kind of talk about in that area. And there's probably not a lot of hot takes, but definitely things that are out there that are people are talking about. So first off, with RedSail Technologies having multiple different PMSs under that umbrella, what is the goal of having that huge swath of independent pharmacies operating within one clinically integrated or technology integrated network?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things, right? Like you don't want to get so big that you can't move, but if you're not big enough, people don't pay attention to you, right? If you're looking at payers and pharma and all of the people who have the dollars in the health system are shunting those dollars to the people they know and are big enough to actually affect change. Like we know that independent pharmacies provide better care, better interactions. Like the experience you get in an independent pharmacy is just orders of magnitude better than you're going to get in your average big box chain. But those big box chains are easy to work with. Think about if I wanted to go sign a contract with 8,000 pharmacies, I could go to CVS or I could go to 8,000 pharmacies. In a span of resources, that's just not a possibility. So I think what you're seeing is companies like CPSN who are going down a clinically integrated network where they're signing contracts with payers on behalf of their pharmacy networks because those payers can go to one place and sign one contract. And then you see people like us going, all right, as a cohort in a network, like we can go talk to pharma and say, hey, look, you're completely neglecting these networks of pharmacies who are driving vaccines at a higher rate than other places. We saw in COVID when contracts got given out to big box contracts. They got the contract and then they got nothing. And they missed people in underserved rural neighborhoods. Independent pharmacies were loading up the van, going out in the backwoods, just vaccinating whoever they could. And so our ability to show that these pharmacies can deliver those types of things to pharma, I think is a really important part of it. And, the goal there is to start trying to be able to bring value back into those pharmacies. Pharma still has, and there are some regulations around remunerating pharmacies for work that we're trying to figure out how to navigate that part. At the very least, we want to be able to bring dollars for things like e-vouchers and coupons at a higher rate to independent pharmacies to help them, if I hate saying this, to offset their losses in what they dispense, but
Sure.
Hopefully eventually be able to make it to where they can actually be excited about dispensing a drug and not bummed that they just dispensed a drug and they lost $50 on it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's almost like, the CPESN group has been working so hard to develop that clinically integrated network, to have those conversations, and they really lean heavy on a why and working together as a group. It seems like when you do have that technology aspect, it gives you the how that makes it a much easier conversation to have sometimes, just from, technically how is this going to be replicated across, 12,000 pharmacies across the country?
Right. Well, and we obviously support CPSN in a lot of ways, but I think one of those is like we stay in touch with them regularly to say like, what types of data do you need? How do we get it to a place more effectively and in a standardized format? One of the things I think we saw with a push toward medical billing was that people tried to go and kind of shoehorn medical billing into a pharmacy's workflow. Well, that only works if you're dispensing a product like a diabetes test strip or a vaccine. But if your pharmacist is doing something that doesn't have that workflow at all, pharmacy is like, I don't know. Well, that was solved 30 years ago. Doctors, physician assistants, occupational therapists, they all bill the exact same way. And so, we have to work with CPSN to say, like, you guys go build the clinical network. We build the technology backbone behind it. And in some cases, being larger helps to be able to kind of, I won't say push, but shepherd those guys into going that route. Otherwise, you're going to end up with 50 people doing it 50 different ways in a totally non-scalable way.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's the thing is scalability, being able to facilitate that kind of, predictable workflow.
Yep.
So moving on to a hot take in that arena, as RedSail Technologies has brought together, the QS1 brands and the PioneerRx brand and the BestRx brand, and other things to come, I'm sure, is the plan to, vertically integrate and migrate to one PMS?
I don't know what 10 years from now Josh will say, but today, the answer is no, right? And one of the things I love about independent pharmacies is they're small and nimble, and they can pivot faster than anybody else in the market. So I think it's naive to think that one pharmacy management system will rule them all, right? There are people who are going to be PioneerRx loyalists, and they're going to be like, there is nothing better. And there will be some people who simply won't use Pioneer because they don't want to. And that's totally fine. And that's where I like the idea, like BestRx is a different system, a lot of the same feature overlap, but they chose to tackle it in a different way with different workflow, with different customizations. And so our plan certainly is to go forward with both of those and say, the rest of the ecosystem will start to unify, right? For example, BestRx has a very nice delivery app. Why would we have 4 different delivery apps across the system?
Right.
The RX Local app is a very robust messaging system and patient portal. Why not use that in BestRx? So I think you'll see those types of things start to unify over time, but the actual PMSs, pick the one that's right for you, and we'll make sure that the data gets to the right place, the ancillary services, the integrations, and all of those things. You pick your tools, and our goal is to make you be the best pharmacist you can be.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that's one of the interesting things that I've witnessed, from the inside the entire time is really that, that focus on giving the pharmacy tools that they can use. And that doesn't necessarily mean, one software. And it's been really neat to see, the development and the strengthening of all of the brands, kind of pulling from the strengths of those. And again, if you tried to force anybody to one platform, I think independent pharmacies they would go back to pen and paper before being dictated.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at it, independence in their name, right? They're like forcing people to do something is always a choice. And there will be some things that we have to force, right? You may have end of life in technologies. You may have, legal and regulatory changes that come into a technology that you can't necessarily support. So over time, software has a life cycle over a period of time. Like nobody's using Lotus 123 anymore, right? You're standardized on Microsoft Excel or Google Sheets or, something along that in this generation. So at some point, some of those things will go away, but it won't be because we're just doing it for fun. In fact, killing a product is harder than building a new product in a lot of ways.
Yeah, when I started at PioneerRx, we had 2 different PMSs in operation, and it was hard. But I mean that other PMS was older than I was, So in the world of technology, that's to be expected. But again, how do you kind of get around that, correlation and causation? Because anything that happens now is definitely, I think online especially can be seen with the lens of since RedSail Technologies or, since whatever event.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, if I knew that, I would probably be a much better marketer than I am. And I get it, right? Like I talk to a lot of pharmacies. In fact, some of my best friends that I've made in this pharmacy world are people who I initially made mad with a feature release that called me up and was like, what the heck are you thinking? And when you call and you're like, hey, here's what it should do, X, Y, and Z, you're like, oh yeah, this guy's really smart. And so like you keep talking to them. And so I generally think the best way to kind of combat that is like, you're never going to get away from, if I thought I could make all 8,000 Pioneer locations happy, I would do it. But there's just no way to do that. But the way I think we can get forward on that is just talk to people. Like realize that the intent is to make pharmacy better, but like my goal isn't to release a feature every so often just to mess your week up, right?
Sure.
Like, and so what we'll do is we'll continually change, we'll continually iterate, and hopefully over time people will see that the march is consistently going forward. Sometimes when you're in that big line, just hurting yourself toward a direction, you don't see how far you've gone until you get there and you're like, oh, hey, this journey was a 5-year journey and it took, blood, sweat, and tears to get there. So I think if you step back a little bit, and it's easier for us to do because we're not behind the counter every day dispensing pills and fighting, regulatory changes and PBM contracts and all the other stuff, right? Like they're in a dogfight day after day. So we can step back a little bit and see, oh, hey, like how far we've actually come. Like PioneerRx still releases 500 plus new features every year and has done so for the last 8.5 years since I've been here. I think we're still taking big swings. Sometimes we miss. But the important part is we're still taking those big swings, and we'll show all of our customers over time that we're still going forward. It just not be at the pace that we all hope it would go.
Yeah. I mean, and one of the interesting things too, anytime a feature comes out, I can generally assume this isn't going to be the first iteration of that feature because, when you do have that two-way communication, it does give you that feedback loop to go ahead and improve, which is really cool. So another hot topic is the PowerLine switch, which I think is one of the coolest things that RedSail Technologies brings to all of our customers. And I think there's a lot of benefits there, but I think it's also kind of misunderstood, and definitely, maybe under communicated. Just how strong those benefits are.
Yeah. So I'll tell you a story. When Pioneer was being sold to RedSail, or actually before that, Craig and Francis came to visit me, Jeff, I think Jenny, and a couple of other people. And they were talking about PowerLine. And at the time, PowerLine was a switch that QS1 owned, and it was only in QS1. And I know for a fact, me, Jeff, and Mark sat in a room after they left, and we were like, why would anybody want to own a switch? Like, it's like the water company, right? Like, it's a commodity. Who cares? Well, you care when there's no water. And we kind of got to see that firsthand when the Change Healthcare cyber event happened last year. Well, there was no water. And so it became kind of increasingly important to be able to feed yourself, right? And, not necessarily having any of our customers at the mercy of like a Relay who's owned by McKesson or a Change who's owned by Optum, and kind of keep that part going. And the other part of it was that we were able to use the switch to keep driving down transaction costs, right? So we can control that. They're not going to go up. They're probably going to keep staying the same or hopefully go down. And that also allows us to go then work with, pharma companies who handle like e-vouchers and all of the other stuff that switches do pre and post edits. Most of the Pioneer customers don't need a lot of pre and post edits because Pioneer handles it natively. And then again, from a RedSail perspective, it gives us a diversity that allows us to have, for example, Kroger's never going to buy PioneerRx. Like they would be insane for allowing that kind of customization on a store by store level. That's just not how a big chain runs.
Sure.
But they could certainly be a customer of ours through the switch. And that again may allow us to go talk to pharma and be able to handle some of those relationships a little bit differently. But the core for how it affects our customers is being able to bring e-vouchers in-house and be able to pay the pharmacies for those e-vouchers and hopefully pay them faster, right? You have in a lot of cases where those e-vouchers would sit in kind of in a holding tank, or the payments for them would sit in a holding tank and then flow. I mean, we know that cash flow is a huge, huge problem for customers. So the faster we can get cash to them, the better off they are.
Yeah. So keeping with your water analogy, keeping the water running is an obvious benefit that, I don't know that there's a better example than the fiasco last year. But another benefit definitely seems to be, leaks in the lines and security, and I know that's an important aspect for every pharmacy, or it should be something that they're thinking about is, data security. Can you talk a little bit about PowerLine and, data security?
Yeah. So anybody who says a cyber attack can't happen to them is bonkers, right? Somebody will attempt it if you're big enough, guaranteed. And if cybersecurity doesn't scare you, you should be scared. But one of the things that was important for PowerLine, and this was actually a change that we made to Pioneer to help after that cyber event, was that the PMS systems often had a direct line from the PMS to the switch, and it was open. So if that line were somehow compromised, you could actually have bad actors going directly into the PMS. And, pre-cyber event, you had a lot of stuff that was sole sourced. For example, almost every instance of medical billing in the country went through Change Healthcare in some way, shape, or form. And we found that out by dentists couldn't bill, pharmacists couldn't bill. So the kind of two changes that you saw that were like rapid changes and for the better was after that event, no one in their right mind is ever going to be sole sourced as a single capability. You might have a primary direction, which for us is PowerLine, but it's also really important that should something happen to take PowerLine down, that you can pivot to one of the other switches very, very quickly. So that was an important part. And the other was to move that direct connection from the PMS to, I guess the best example would be to kind of call it a demilitarized zone, where the claims go to this kind of pre-staging area that is kept secure and off the same network so that you can route them from there to a switch. Now, for failover, you still have to have a direct line be able to pop open, because if that node goes down, then you have some issues. But, in terms of what we did with PowerLine, it's modern technology, cloud native, all of those, fun business buzzwords. But the net result there is that the uptime is going to be much easier to maintain, and the ability to collapse it if something were to infect one of those nodes, just nuke it and start over, is much, much faster. Like Change Healthcare took them, at this point, months and months to be able to rebuild, and some things are still not totally up.
Right.
That's a function of not being able to do that in the cloud. Now, I'm sure they rebuilt it in a way that if that happens again, they can nuke it and start over faster. But PowerLine was built that way from the start because we were able to come into that game 15 years, 20 years after the original switches.
Yeah. So I think the next consideration would be, that data, where it goes outside of the payer, is it going where it needs to go, and is it not going where it shouldn't?
Yeah, there's definitely, there's always concerns about that, right? Controlling data and data leakage is important. And, there's certain things where data has to go, right? It has to go to the PBMs for third-party claims. It has to go to reconciliation sources and things like that. And then there's, all the kind of crazy data brokers and things like that go on outside of it. But for all intents and purposes, PowerLine was built to be able to handle, like, if it goes here, it goes here, and it's very controlled and very secure, and it shouldn't go anywhere else outside of that. And, one of the things I think we did a good job of was being kind of cognizant about making sure that data rights were maintained and not given out and kind of propagated for people who didn't necessarily need it. And I'll be transparent. One of the big complaints we got was, early on, and this I think was even before I came to Pioneer, we started working with SureScript's MedHistory for providing information to MedHistory, so that the idea was if you went to a hospital or emergency department, you were unconscious or couldn't tell people tell the physicians what medications you're on, they could go query it and pull it over. It's a patient safety thing. So we said, hey, we're going to participate, and you don't want that, then sorry. But that was an interesting discussion. But those are things there. But we're very careful to make sure that independent pharmacy data doesn't get leaked out into the world. Now, that's to say, I hope there's never a data breach. Saying it's impossible is impossible.
Again, as we saw last year.
Yeah. Like, never say never, but we're very, very careful to make sure that that's protected and as leak proof as we can make it.
So one of the things that you mentioned earlier was the ability to kind of drive down the cost of claims, across the board. Tell me a little bit about that, because we've also made some changes, to the fee structure in general. And whenever I explain like our fee structure to somebody at a trade show, they're like, wow, that makes a lot of sense. Like, that's really cool. But again, if you don't, kind of have that one-on-one conversation, especially if you're a longtime user and you've just experienced, different pricing methods, can you tell me a little bit about how we, managed to have a 1 cent claim transmission fee, and then two, kind of describe the other fees associated with the completed claim?
Yeah. So historically, pharmacy management systems had really two ways to get revenue from customers. The first is kind of your monthly subscription fee, right? That's the cost of support and maintenance and all that other stuff. And the second one was transactions. Okay. And the bulk of that was switch fees. So when you switch a claim from a pharmacy to PowerLine, Relay, whatever, there's a cost to that. There's an actual cost because those switches have, servers and APIs and things like that. And the switches sold the switch cost back to the PMS at a wholesale rate. And then the PMS systems would mark up that switch fee and that was it, right? So at least historically, roughly half of your bill comes from maintenance costs and the other half comes from transaction. It's kind of one of those where like everybody pays the same freight for support, maintenance, et cetera, no matter how big you are. And then the switch fees, depending on how high your volume was, that's where you kind of pay that. If I do 10,000 scripts a day, I pay 10,000 scripts worth of switch fees. If you do 50 a day, you pay 50, right? So that's your variable cost for size. Now, we made a decision, and it's probably 7 years ago.
It's been quite a while.
Yeah, it's been a long time. And it took a while because we had to talk to a lot of customers and get it going. But in one of the Pioneer management meetings, we kind of came down to the part where there were some people who were like compounds are using a lot of cash that weren't switching. And so they were really busy using a lot of resources and things like that. So they weren't paying that switch fee. And there were a lot of people who couldn't really control, like if they were in a high commercial pay place where they had a lot of prior auths, step therapies, things like that. We were looking and some of their the number of switches it took to get a paid claim was 3, 4, 5. Some of them we saw 8 or 9. And so each of those switch fees had a cost for the switch, but each of those switch attempts also had that markup attached to it.
Yeah,
and
so that 8 or 10 cents per transmission, right?
You might have paid $1 for that. And if you work at Walgreens, you don't care, right? Switch away until it pays. But, we were looking at like, what's the best thing that's the most fair for our customers? And the end result was, let's move that markup on the switch fee to a completed transaction fee. And the idea there was to be like, hey, we'll be totally transparent. That's what PioneerRx is charging you in terms of your variable cost. And we'll only get that if you complete that prescription, right? Like if you switch it 10 times and the patient never picks it up, well, you had to pay 10 at cost switch units, but you didn't have to pay 10 times the markup. And that way It kind of felt like it felt transparent and it felt fair. And it made it equalized the playing field again. So if you're using, a hub pharmacy who transfers out, we're counting those transfer outs a completed portion of it. If you're doing cash or compounding, you're still paying, 8 cents a completed fee. So some of those guys paid a little bit more, but on average, it worked out to mostly a wash. But we could genuinely look in people in the eye and be like, hey, look, we're aligned. When you win, we win. We're only going to get paid when you can sell a prescription.
Yeah. Yeah. And, it is an interesting model to take that pressure off of, when you look at a single claim where you're, hopefully making $1, and you can eat that up pretty quick just with, rejected or reversed claims, those multiple transmissions for that paid claim. So, hopefully for many of our pharmacies, it actually kind of brought that down a little bit.
Yeah, we actually saw a number of pharmacies end up paying less than they would have if we'd not done that. But even beyond that, like I think there's a part where, like when you have as many customers as we have, there's a component where you want to be able to tell the person to your left and your right, like, hey, I'm charging you the exact same for the exact same services, right? Nobody was so big that they could bully us around and we're charging this guy less than this guy. And it was kind of a, hey, look, I want to be on, we need to have the same incentives, right? I personally would love every pharmacy in our network to do 10,000 scripts a day because they make more money and we make more money, right? And you want us to have the same incentives so that we can march in the same direction.
So one of the other topics that I wanted to talk about are vouchers. You kind of mentioned that a little bit. Manufacturer vouchers at the switch. Is that a good thing for independent pharmacies?
I think in general, yes. In a lot of ways, vouchers exist solely to change behavior, right? If I mean, let's not be under an illusion. Any manufacturer would be crazy to buy down a cost of a drug if the net result was the same, right? So we know that there's a certain amount of data that pharma knows that if they're not tiered in an advantageous point on a PBM, they have to offer copay assistance, because at a certain point, and I don't know exactly what that cost point is, customers will say, "No, I'm not going to buy that drug." So they certainly help with adherence. And one of the other things that a lot of those e-vouchers do is when the pharma company buys it down, the voucher company has an administration fee and they take some of that. And then they have the pharmacy portion, and some of those dollars get passed back to the pharmacy. And historically, we've not had that capability ourselves, so we had to purchase it from another source, right? Another switch. And so what that means is the switch gets a portion of it, and the pharmacy gets a smaller portion of it. And so what we're trying to do is say, all right, PowerLine can handle those vouchers directly. Because there's not a third person in there now, we can function as the voucher administrator, and the pharmacy gets a bigger portion of that pie. And the second portion of that is we wanted to accelerate the speed to payment, so that as soon as pharma pays the voucher administrator, us, we basically pass that through directly to our customers, because we already have a customer relationship with them. And so we already have ACH information and things like that. So in theory, we could pay the pharmacies more per voucher and faster.
So yeah, in the last year, we released a few different new features that would help pharmacies identify claim issues, like the ability to see the claim UH and the FQ fields on the prescription label, being able to just draw attention to that additional message, and as well as like adding in some different areas, being able to see the primary response plan ID. So we released a handful of features that were looking out for these claim activities where, you know, things are happening that are not advantageous for the pharmacy, but those same fields are used on those voucher programs that are very advantageous to the patient and pharmacy.
Yep.
So yeah, so how can a pharmacy just make sure that they're aware of when either is happening, and then how to tell if that is a good or bad program?
So I think it's, first of all, important to note that those are two very, very different programs, right? The PBM switching to a cash claim is almost always negative, and the voucher is almost always a positive thing. In fact, I don't know of a scenario where adding a voucher is not a positive thing. And for Pioneer users specifically, there's two things that I would always do, and this is independent of this type of program. Having your RX edit that handles the negative remit should be on all the time. And we are working on another RX edit right now that should go out in a couple of weeks, that will look at that FQ field and compare whether the outgoing bin number and group number is the same as the incoming bin and group number.
Oh,
nice. If that's different, then there's a good indication that something different happened. That may not be a bad different, but from what we can tell, and I looked at a lot of claims and talked to a lot of pharmacists about this, that's usually the first thing. If the outgoing bin and group is different than the ingoing, you can bet that the processor changed that to something, and that's 99.9% of the time is one of those cash cards. But definitely between that and the negative remit, you should catch all of those. And internally, between my side of the business on the pharmacy management and the RedSail Advantage, which is where PowerLine lives, we've had a bunch of internal discussions about how we can, basically automatically protect pharmacies from something like that happening. Now, the switch has to be kind of a neutral part, right? When you send a claim to a bin, it has to and should follow those rules and say, if the bin says reroute it to X, we have to reroute it. It's like the post office, right? When you write an address on an envelope, the post office is going to deliver it there, whether it's a bill or a lottery ticket winning, right? Like they don't control that part. So we have to be careful there, but we should be able to make it much more transparent about when things like that happen. And that's part of, one of the other things that's really nice about us owning the Switch is we have more visibility into that now. A couple of years ago, I would have had to kind of do some back channel stuff and say, hey, can we look at the claims and find out, is it always like this? But now that we have PowerLine, I could reach over to my counterpart at PowerLine and say, hey, I have a couple of prescription numbers. Let me see what those claims look like. And that way we can see the inbound and outbound bins. And that's where we were able to look at that pattern and say, oh, hey, look, we don't have to look at this FQ field and do a query on looking for specific words. We can just say, if the inbound and outbound bin and group are different, there's something wrong.
Yeah, interesting. So, kudos to the pharmacies out there that reached out to me because they, have such claim awareness, which is unfortunate that, you need to be vigilant to watch out for those kinds of programs. But yeah, definitely being able to, identify, advantageous programs that are using those same, standard identifying fields. So, so that's something that I had a lot of questions about is, manufacturer voucher programs. Can we expect to see more of those in the future?
Yes, you should expect to see more. We'll have a couple more coming online in the next week or two. And the other thing, I hope you not only see more of them, but I hope that one of the things that we want to be able to show is that when you run these types of vouchers in a RedSail system, you get an outsized value to both the pharma manufacturers see a better uptake in patients' adherence and taking the right drugs at the right times. And so we hope that we can navigate that into saying, look, instead of spending these dollars on, infomercials at 10 o'clock at night, spend those dollars in buying down copays to make it more advantageous for pharmacies to want to carry brand name drugs. We can't live in a world where a pharmacy doesn't make money off of a brand name drug, especially when a lot of the brands are coming in like that pseudo specialty market where they don't necessarily have to go to a specialty pharmacy. And we don't want to live in a world where you introduce polypharmacy to patients and saying, hey, just get your generics from me, go get all your brand name drugs from CVS down the road. Right. Like that's an unsustainable market. And so our hope is to be able to take what we can do with vouchers and say, look, well, hopefully PBMs go away, but in the chance that doesn't happen, you need to be able to say incentivize the pharma manufacturers to be able to want to pay the pharmacies more to ensure that the patients stay on those drugs.
Yeah, and I feel like we're kind of early in that conversation that I think is going to continue evolve. I hope it's going to continue to evolve where, we get to the point that RedSail Technologies becomes the easy button or the first thing that they think of when it's time to spend those marketing dollars somewhere. Instead of thinking of the big box or, like you said, infomercials, that just becomes the first choice. And, that's a really exciting revenue opportunity that, just goes straight to our base users.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, and what you'd love to see is if you could say, how many of our pharmacies would happily dispense a GLP-1 if they didn't lose $50 to $100 every time they dispensed it, right? There's no reason not to. So either the PBM has to reimburse more for that money, and you and I both know that they're going to laugh in our face if you ask them to do that. Or the pharma manufacturer needs to be able to say, hey, I can change my pharmacy or my patient's behavior by buying down more of that drug and allowing the pharmacy to keep more of that buy down. And so if you made $15 or $20 per GLP-1, that's a very, very different outlook for your cash flow. And so those are the types of things we want to be able to do by making RedSail, like you said, the easy button.
Yeah. So we're kind of winding down on time here, but what do you see in development, whether it's PioneerRx specifically or across the PMS line? What's important and what's exciting for your March right now?
Yeah, so I kind of divide my product roadmap into two spots. One is I'm kind of calling this the year of Tim Duncan, right? I want to go back and spend a lot of time on speed, stability, and interfaces. The things that our customers use all day, every day, speed up queues, make the applications more responsive. And this is true, by the way, of Pioneer and BestRx and our new cloud-based product, Axis. Speed, stability, and interfaces have to be best of breed and always functional. So we're going to spend an inordinate amount of time doing that this year. And then the other is really thinking about ways that I don't want to use automation to replace a pharmacist or a tech. I want to use automation to replace kind of silly processes, right? The more things we can do in terms of pulling in structured data from faxes, automating data entry, adjudication, overrides, things like that. So this year, you'll start to see us doing a lot more. At first, you'll see us doing a lot more research and planning around being able to do that. And hopefully that sets the playing field for being able to release some of those automation type activities into the world either later this year or early next.
Yeah. So I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't bring up AI, because that's another question everybody asks me. How does AI fit into future development from features or analytics? Where does that play in, or does it at all?
So anybody who says it fixes everything is going to be wildly wrong. And anybody who says it doesn't play at all is also going to be equally wrong. Where we're looking at it, obviously in terms of software development, being able to use some of those tools to speed up software development or to make better optimizations, better test cases, things like that. We're already using AI in those areas. And then we're starting to look at using AI. We actually have a fax pilot going out hopefully in the next week or so, where we'll be able to take an inbound fax, use some AI over the top of it, and be able to shred that into basically turning a fax into an electronic prescription so we can apply other automation to that. So I think you'll see us using AI over the next year to assist manual activities in a pharmacy, and then kind of grow it from there. And to be clear, like some of those automation things, they make a ton of sense. It'd be crazy not to do them. Some of the more advanced type AI use of technology, like imagine using AI to display clinical alerts. You have to be a lot more careful about that because you don't want the AI to hallucinate and make up what kind of clinical alerts are there, or drug interactions, things like that. So there's some, you have to be a lot more careful when there's a real human at the end that has very real consequences of us making mistakes.
Yeah, it's automating Dr. Google seems like a bad idea.
Yeah, everybody's going to have like immediately Dr. Google says everybody has cancer. I don't want to be in that spot. So we have to put up some impressive guardrails for that. So I don't think you'll see something that pervasive in the next couple of years at least.
Yeah, for sure. Well, just wanted to thank you for coming on. One of the things that I think is cool about the PioneerRx evolution and the RedSail Technologies in general is that I can just message you and say, hey, I had a lot of stuff that, I keep getting asked. I just wanted to talk to you about. And you're like, yeah, absolutely. I want to have you come back on as well with Andy, if possible, and also that line of communication. I just messaged him the other day to ask if he would join us. And, it is still great to, be big and act small in some of those regards.
Yeah. And I think, just that same kind of place, like we want to keep that open, right? One of the best parts of my job is being able to go into a pharmacy or go to a trade show and have a bunch of really interested pharmacists come up and talk to me and say, hey, here's what I'm trying to do. How can I do that? And sometimes the answer is, well, you can't today, but let me go figure out how to do it.
Yeah.
So, we will continue to be transparent and talk to customers, and we hear you. We may not be able to do all 20,000 ideas we get every year, but we do a lot of them, and we want to continue to do that.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for joining us, and we're going to have you back on pretty soon. So looking forward to that. I know you've got a lot going on, so let's get back to it.
All right. Thanks, Will.